Let me actually, now that the time is here, let's use it up efficiently. We're very happy to have for our seminar series now as Dr. Oben Ceryan, who's a senior lecturer from BASE, is that the correct pronunciation? I'm hoping, business school in
right.
City University of London, which apparently changed its name recently, as I understand from the history of the school. He received his PhD degree from University of Michigan, and his research interests include dynamic pricing, revenue management, operations marketing, and supply chain management. His work has been published, as I understand, from a long list of very reputable journals in the area. And he also was recognized by being selected as a featured article through a Ford Motor Company Best Paper Award, which is wonderful. He teaches courses on pricing and revenue management, quantitative methods and analytics, and supply chain analytics. And he's joining us today from London, I'm assuming. Thank you for being here again, and thank you for joining our seminar. I would like to remind the attendees that this is the Zoom webinar series, and I'd like to get your feedback on the usage, but apparently when you want to ask questions, you have to click on that raise hand button, and you are all muted. So when you do that, I'll apparently, as the host, will have to let you unmute. For upcoming seminar series, we'll consider if we have to, it will continue using this. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Dr. Ceryan, and thank you for being here again.
Thank you so much again for your introduction, and first of all, for your very kind invitation as well. I'm really very happy to be able to speak to your group. Izmir also is my hometown, so this is a really special occasion for me as well. And I hope to be able to meet you in person very soon too. So thank you again for your kind invitation. So I can just before I start, I just want to let you know that I can take your questions at any time if you write it through the chat or raise your hand if I can see it. So you don't really have to wait until the very end of the talk. I'll be very happy to clarify things as we go along. So today I'd like to talk about optimal dynamic allocation of rental and sales inventory for fashion apparel products. So this is a joint work with Mehmet Şekip Altuğ. He is currently an associate professor at George Mason University. We started working on the rental, joint rental and sales models a number of years ago, when we kind of observed, as everyone else, the changing consumer trends in retail, especially in apparel retail. So report after report says that, and this is our observation as well, that a growing segment of population now prefers not to own. And there are various reasons that drive this behavior. For example, one of the fundamental reasons that people prefer not to own is that they seek variety. And rather than owning a few items, they would rather like to have access to many, many more, and be able to utilize that sort of like a more increased assortment for their choice, especially when they're attending special events. And a second reason is that especially the younger generation is more conscious about sustainability issues. And rather than owning items, they also have a higher utility in a way, more satisfaction if they believe that they participate in a circular economy where they share the items with others. So in this way, it's not just them that use the items, maybe perhaps very infrequently, but rather more people will also be able to use the items simultaneously as well. And then another factor is that it's more affordable. So as you can imagine, renting an item is generally only a fraction of the cost of purchasing that item. So that also plays a role in as well. And so a recent report by McKinsey & Company also in 2019 said that more consumers will see a growing proportion of their wardrobes made up of either pre-owned or rented products. This is especially true for high-value items and also accessories. And so this ongoing trend in the change of consumer behavior also led to many different businesses and business models actually entering the apparel retail industry. A number of years ago, for example, a company called Rent the Runway became really the forefront of the apparel rental, like fashion apparel rental business. And apart from that, we see a lot of other rental-oriented, rental-focused companies as well. Like some other examples are Land in Luxury or Glam Corner. And there are also various subcategories about how these companies operate. Some of them work with individual rental prices, whereas some of them have moved more into like a subscription, like a Netflix type of model, where you subscribe for like on a monthly basis, and you receive a number of items, and depending on when you send them, you receive new items back. Now, besides these rental-focused companies, we also see that increasingly the traditional retailers are also entering into the rental market alongside their regular sales. So, for example, in the US, Ann Taylor has opened up a rental channel besides their regular sales channel. And the same is true for Express Bins, Bloomingdale's, Urban Outfitters, and Banana Republic as well. And essentially these companies, noticing that there is an increasing rental demand, would not like to lose customers to the two separate markets on the rental part of the market, but rather be able to serve part of that market themselves as well. So this is our sort of like the general setting that we wanted to focus on. And the problem that we wanted to work on was for companies, either they could be rental focused or they could be sales focused, or perhaps they don't have any focus at all. Like maybe they're actually serving both markets roughly with equal priorities. A very important thing that comes up in all these discussions is that running these businesses successfully requires, in a way, overcoming challenges in operations, running these profitably and effectively. And that is, for example, how do you allocate your inventory that could be sold in both different channels, like either at the rental channel or at or for the sales channel, and how do you really set up the logistics behind this and the digitalization requirements behind this. So these are all very important to be able to resolve, to be able to run these businesses profitably. So the problem that in this first work that we wanted to focus on was on the operations side, essentially. And we wanted to understand how do companies that serve these rental and sales market should optimally allocate their inventories across two different types of demand categories. And so the main research question that we'll be looking at today is, will be for a retailer that is primarily a renter, like the Rent-A-Runway business model, but having incidental sales. So their main focus is rentals, so they will be prioritizing rentals, but they also serve the sales demand as it occurs to the extent that they wish to satisfy that demand. So for that type of a retailer, how should the retailer dynamically allocate its inventory for rentals and sales throughout the season? So this is our main problem that we'll be looking at today. And what we want to understand is overall, how do market characteristics, that the ones that I just mentioned before, and I'll be opening that up in sort of like building our consumer demand model as well, but how do market characteristics such as variety-seeking behavior, such as usage frequency, such as the prices of the products, and outside options come into play in influencing this optimal allocation. So we would like to be able to understand more about the market characteristics and composition, and how the optimal allocation should be adjusted based on changes in these market characteristics. And we also tested, derived and tested some very easy to implement heuristic policies. So we were really curious about being able to come up with effective heuristics so that this could be implemented. And I'll be introducing you a very simple heuristic that takes into account some of the main trade-offs from the revenue management literature. And with some modifications we applied here, and I'll show that it's actually has a very good performance in this setting as well. Later on, I'll just show you some brief extensions on results about companies that are primarily sellers, so they focus on sales business as their core business, but they might incidentally rent as well on the side. So how do they decide, how should they decide on their allocation in this setting? And we'll also look into cases where there's no priority across these markets. So these are our main research questions. So I want to very briefly touch on the related work on this area. So rental business has existed for quite a long time, actually, when we think about the leasing of durable goods. And so there has been some early results in this area, mainly focusing on when is actually leasing better than selling a product. And if there's competition, whether a company should be focusing on leasing or selling a product, or do both of them. So the existing literature tells us that, for example, in general, if there's an anticipated decrease in the price, then companies might prefer leasing to sales. And in many cases, there might be instances where a company might want to operate in both leasing and sales markets simultaneously. Then in terms of the operations literature, there has been some focus on inventory management in particular within the context of renting. So the main focus there has been the quantity selection problem. So for example, the earlier work by Tainter and by Whistler was focusing on the appropriate initial quantity selection decision for the rental market, and later work as well has that as their main focus. Whereas in this work, our focus will be mostly on, so we will be also deciding on the initial quantity, but our focus in this work will be on a more operational basis, in the sense that we will do tactical allocation decisions from period to period of that initial quantity, of the remaining part of that initial quantity, into the two different channels. And lastly, as I briefly mentioned, the work also touches slightly on the revenue management literature, where we will be influenced by the sort of like the results and the heuristic idea behind the main revenue management trade-offs, for example, Littlewood's rule, to be able to test simple to implement heuristic policies in this setting. And I'll make more comparisons on that when I describe the heuristic policy itself. So let me start with the consumer demand model and how we thought about bringing in these different types of heterogeneities in the consumer base into a model that helps us distinguish between the rental and the sales demand. So in this paper, we consider consumer heterogeneity in 4 different dimensions. So the first of these is the use frequency. So this is how frequently, as like its name implies, how frequently consumers, a particular consumer, would need to use this or reuse this product. So we use the total usage through a geometric distribution, and we assume that there is a distribution parameter Qi. So this is a 2-point distribution. We have Q low and Q high, and Q here is defined as the probability of last use. So anytime consumer, let's say with high use frequency, uses a product with probability QH, this will be that consumer's last use of that product. For example, you bought a dress, you really don't know when will be the last time maybe you will be wearing that dress, but essentially every time that you wear a dress, there's a certain probability that that might be your last time that you're wearing that dress. So that's the probability of last usage. And so for people that have higher use frequencies, the probability of last usage is lower, clearly. So it's more likely that they will be continuing to use this product in the future as well. So Q high, meaning that for the consumers that have high use frequency, in other words, that they have an expectation of a larger number of times that they will be using this product, QH is lower than QL. So once again, their last use probability will be lower compared to those consumers who might have a low frequency of usage. And we also consider the market is composed of these high frequency users and the low frequency users based on a certain fractional, like a ratio essentially. So we think that we will just use a parameter theta h as the fraction of high use consumers in the market. And the reason that we're introducing also sort of like the market composition is because we want to be able to say things later on about what if for a certain product category, the fraction of high users is higher or lower, for example. How would that impact our allocation decision? So this is the first dimension of the of consumer heterogeneity. Now the second sort of like very important heterogeneity comes from the desire for variety, or we could label this also as fashion consciousness. So we will assume that again, this is a two-point distribution. People might have high desire for variety or perhaps low desire for variety. This could be again interpreted as high fashion consciousness or low fashion consciousness. So the way that we model this is as follows. So for example, for a purchasing customer, let's say that the customer has purchased a dress. The first time that they wear that dress, they might get some valuation V out of wearing that dress. Now, the second time that they will be wearing this dress, we assume that there's going to be some sort of a satiation effect, and due to the desire of variety, perhaps the valuation that they get from their second use would only be a fraction of their valuation of their previous use. And this will continue. The third use will only retain a certain fraction also of their previous use. So essentially what we're trying to capture here is that the more that perhaps like someone wears a dress, the less valuation that they will be getting out of wearing that dress each subsequent time. So eventually, if someone wears a dress a number of times, a long enough number of times, then their valuation would tend to approach, will be getting closer to zero. So the parameter that will be representing this is gamma. So we'll assume that gamma j is the fraction of the valuation that a consumer would retain for their subsequent use of an item that they own. For high conscious people, high fashion conscious people, or for, in other words, for people who have a higher desire for variety, we will, so for them, we have the parameter gamma h. So we assume that this gamma h is less than gamma l. What that means is that they retain a lower amount, a lower fraction of their use, their valuation for each subsequent use. So if, let's say, they get a valuation of 10 this time, a high fashion conscious person maybe would be discounting it by 0.5. So the next time that they will be wearing, they will only get a valuation of 5. And the next time it will be 2.5. Whereas perhaps a person who has lower desire of variety, a low fashion consciousness in a way, we might say, think that the next time that they would use it, they might retain 90% of the valuation. So they'll still get a valuation of 9 the next time that they wear the product. And regarding the market composition, we assume that phi h of the market consists of the high variety seeking type consumers. The third type of heterogeneity that we consider is outside options, the strength of outside options. So this is where actually the rental model has also like an additional advantage where when a customer rents a product, they're not tied up to using that product. So once they use the product, they will be returned the product. And now they have new options for them, like new dresses, maybe new models, new colors to them that they might would like to try. And therefore, we just wanted to include sort of like an additional abstract utility form for customers that once they rent, for each of their subsequent usages, they might go for something different. And they might have a separate additional utility, let's call that as UK, due to the flexibility of not owning this product and having outside options for their remaining uses. And so we will again have a fraction of consumers with high outside utility and with some low outside utility as well. And we again denote this outside utility by the parameter U. And lastly, and this is more classical, we assume that the consumers also are heterogeneous in their valuations overall. So some consumers might value a particular occasion of wearing a dress much higher than others. And so the individual valuations, we will be using a uniform distribution between 0 and some upper bar, at some V bar. Okay, so how do these come together? Now, let's assume that the price of the rental product is PR and the price of the sales item is PS. And let's take into account a consumer that has a use frequency type I, a variety seeking behavior type J, and an outside utility type K. So these could be either low or high. And they have a per use valuation of V. So when we compute the expected net utility from purchasing, so we have the following expression. The consumer, in their first use, they will get a valuation of V. So it will be essentially 1 times V. If there's a second use, so this will be, they will have 2 uses with probability 1 minus QI. They will retain their valuation, like gamma J of their valuation in their second use. And similarly, they will be retaining gamma J squared of their valuations in their second use, okay? So on the one hand, we have the sort of like the retained valuation part here, like every time that they use, they only retain a fraction of their previous valuation. And also we account for the likelihood that like they might stop using the product. So every time that they use a product, it might be their last time. So there's only a certain probability that they will be moving into the second use or the third uses and so on. And so this is their total valuation from this product in the lifetime, and now we subtract the sales price of the product, and we can just simply equivalently write this in this form as well. Okay, so this is the expected net utility from purchasing a product. So it's V over 1 minus gamma J times 1 minus QI minus the price of the product, the sales price of the product. Now let's take a look at the expected net utility from renting. For a renting customer, they don't have a repeat use in terms of like a reduced valuation every time they can buy, they can rent a new item for themselves. So only in their first use, they would get a net utility of V minus PR. And then for each of their subsequent uses, their expected number of subsequent uses, we just abstracted with their outside options, UK. And so equivalently, we can just write it as V minus PR plus 1 minus QI over QI times UK, their outside options. And we can also assume different forms on their outside options as well. For example, it just can be a replication of V minus PR with an expected NI minus 1 times as well. So, but we just wanted to keep it a little bit more abstract and general. And consequently, a consumer of type IJK, so again, with use frequency type I, with variety seeking behavior type J, and outside utility type K, and a particular valuation V, this consumer will prefer purchasing over renting if essentially their expected net utility from purchasing exceeds the expected net utility from renting. And they would eventually purchase if their expected utility from purchasing is also greater than 0. So this defines their preferences between the 2 different types of products based on their frequency of usages, based on their variety-seeking behavior, based on their outside options, and based on the prices of the products, as well as their observed valuation. Now, the rest is fairly standard, but we can just essentially calculate the total for the overall market, for the aggregate market, what is the total rental fraction and what is the total sales fraction. And so the overall proportion of customers preferring to purchase or rent is given by alpha. So this is the total sales fraction, and beta, so this is the total rental fraction. So this will be for each particular sort of like division of the market based on the IJK profiles, the frequency of usage, the variety seeking, and the outside options, what fraction of that sub-market prefers to buy or prefers to rent, multiplied by, so we just add these up, multiplied by the fraction of essentially that market. And this also allows us a little bit more generality in the sense that we can also work with some correlations between, for example, thetas and phis here, meaning that perhaps the sub market, which has a higher frequency of use, might also be in a way, let's say, more or less fashion conscious. So we can build in some of these correlations into this model as well. And overall, each period, we will have some random demand that we will be observing, dt, and that demand will be splitting into a sales demand and a rental demand based on these ratios. So the total sales demand will be alpha times dt, and the total rental demand will be beta times dt. So this is the overall consumer model. So now let me introduce you the problem formulation overall. And to do that, I'll start with the timeline of events. And again, our main focus here will be the primary renter and seller on the side model. So at the very beginning of the horizon, the retailer first sets an initial inventory level Q. And this inventory will be used to serve both the sales and the rental markets throughout the horizon. At each subsequent period T, the retailer will observe its inventory level. So let's label that as XT at the beginning of period T. And they will also observe the demand during that period. Now, because this retailer is a primary renter, they will first prioritize the rental demand. So what that means is that they will fulfill as much of the rental demand as their inventory permits. And at the end of the period, having observed their remaining inventory after rental, so they started with XT, and they will satisfy the rental demand, so they will have something less than XT, so that's their remaining inventory after rentals. And having observed the total demand as well as the sales demand, they will then decide on how much of sales demand to satisfy, if any, obviously, so they can refuse to satisfy any sales demand because they think perhaps keeping the item as a rental unit might bring them more revenue overall for a number of more periods before they sell the item. So their sale quantity will be denoted by ST. And after they sell, all of these units will leave their inventory, they're sold, and they will not be returning back. Whereas the items that they have previously rented will come back at the end of the period. So we assume that all of the rental units will be returned at the end of the period. And later we will relax this assumption in the sense that what if some items don't get returned? What if some of the items are lost? So I'll be discussing that later. So this is the timeline of the events. And here's a dynamic programming formulation. So we let VTXT denote the value function essentially. So this is the expected discounted profit to go under the optimal policy, starting at state XT in period T. So the first term here is our expected profit from satisfying the rental demand during that period. So starting that period with XT units of inventory, we can satisfy essentially the minimum of like what we have versus what the rental demand turned out to be during that period. So we meet the demand as much as what our inventory allows us to do. And so for each unit, we will be receiving a rental revenue of PR minus we assume that there's some sort of cost of unit cost of serving this rental market. And this cost include things like the logistics, oftentimes like the cleaning as well. For example, the Rent the Runway company that I had mentioned, its founder claims that they might be running perhaps the largest cleaning operation, like dry cleaning operation in apparel, like in fashion apparel, because that's a very, very big sort of like a logistics of an operational issue for them and a big cost driver, having been able to clean those products for their second use. So we assume that there could be some cost to essentially refurbish these products so that they are that they could be rented again the next period. So the second bit is where the firm decides how much of the sales demand that they would meet. So having observed the demand, they would like to maximize essentially their current period income as well as their future profit to go by deciding on the best sales quantity. And the sales quantity would be limited by the observed sales demand during that period, so they cannot sell more than what the demand was. And also they cannot sell more than what their current inventory position is. So they start the period with XT and they have already rented out PDT of these items, at most BDT of these items. And so that also constrains how much they can sell and satisfy to the sales market. So once they sell ST units, they will be receiving the sales price PS. And then for the next period, they will be starting with a new inventory position of XT minus ST. Once again, they started the previous period with XT units. They sell ST, so those units permanently leave their inventory position. But whatever they rent, we assume that they come back at the end of the period, so they're now back here. And so the next period, they will just be starting with XT minus ST. And again, just to remind you, we will be sort of like introducing what would happen if some of these units don't come back. And finally, we also assume that the company can salvage any excess units at H per unit at the end of the horizon. So this is the dynamic programming formulation. Any questions up until now about overall either the consumer demand model or the dynamic programming formulation before I present the results? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing that I want to make sure, because we're using this for the first time, I made you the host. So yes. Now you either have to make me a co-host again if you can, or otherwise if there are, yeah, or if there are people who want to ask questions when they raise your hands, because I cannot unmute them. You only now can unmute people other than me. So just
all right, great.
You know, all right, just to let you know, I have one question, but I'll hold on until I see some results. But
right. I have one question though. If I make you host, it doesn't say make co-host, it says
okay.
make host.
Okay, then you will handle the questions. There's one question actually in the chat box, so already.
Okay. Yeah, there's a question I think by Önder. Can I? Yeah, about the DP. So please go ahead. Yes.
He cannot speak up until you unmute him from the participants list.
Great. Okay. Önder, can you speak up now?
Can you hear me, Hocam?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. To make it more clear at this time point before the details, thank you for this opportunity for my question. Okay, here, depending on the values of P sub R, C sub R, and P sub S, is it always optimal or better to satisfy the rental demand? This is what you are doing, right? Is it an assumption, or you think that it is always optimal?
Right. So yeah, that's a great question. So here the underlying in a way, like the framework in the model is that we always meet the rental demand. So we're not deciding whether we should meet the rental demand or not in this case. And the question is actually is that, well, if PR is so low, why should I actually be forced to meet that demand, for example, right?
Yes.
So here, this setup we're assuming we're looking at initially is that this is a company that's purely focused on rentals, like mainly focused on rentals, and they're selling on the side. And sort of like there's an inherent assumption here is that because it's their business, they wouldn't pick a price that they would actually make rentals to be completely irrelevant to them, because like they're a rental focused company. So that's the first thing. Yeah, so we are actually, so we have that inherent assumption here. But as I will show later very soon, that these allocations certainly depend on PR and PS as well. And I'll tell you about like how the allocations change when PR or PS is different. Like if PR is higher or PS is lower, how do these allocations change? And later on as well, we'll be looking into models where they might be sales focused, and in which case perhaps they might refuse any of the rental demand. So in this model, they might refuse any of the sales demands because it's their choice. And lastly, I will also very briefly introduce a model where they don't really have any prioritization. So they will just be free to decide essentially how they allocate their inventory. So we look at all possible cases here. But the first one that I wanted to discuss, and the main one, is that they're a rental focused business. So it really wouldn't make sense for them to set a rental price that it would make them not to satisfy any of the rental demand. Does that clarify?
Thank you, Hocam. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the question.
And at this point, let me ask my question as well, now that we kind of interrupted
Sure,
you anyway.
please. Yes, go ahead.
I'm really, as research-wise, not very close to pricing and revenue management. But this is very interesting because I was at one point in time interested in managing apparel industry and otherwise scheduling inventory, those kind of things, production. But at this point, when you present this consumer demand model at these 4 dimensions
Yes.
that you formulated, so it is essentially based on those. Actually, we can say, based on the utility or the age or the demographics, let's say, there's basically different consumer people, and they might choose to rent more, or their utility, based on usage or rental or ownership changes. So, so in essence, seems like by this kind of model, you should be able to even maybe go further and tell which kind of products, based on who they appeal to, what kind of consumer appeal to, is it better to run as a primarily rent or primarily sell kind of model. I don't know if you're going to go there, but seems like that is also possible, because once the product is out, there's actually a market, there's a target consumer section or demography, let's say, and based on the knowledge, it's probably you can come up with the best way of using that product specifically for either primary rent, primary resale, or just indifferent.
Right. I think that's an excellent comment. Thank you so much. Yes. So let me just add one thing, and then I'd like to respond further to your comment. So here, when I introduced the overall proportion of consumers, for example, who prefer to rent, right, or who prefer to purchase. So this depends on the subcategory. So we have a fraction for each subcategory. So maybe a subcategory in the market is maybe like the young people, who might turn out to be that within this setup, they actually would not like to buy. So maybe their purchasing is very low and their renting is very high. And you might have a different category where maybe alpha IJK is very high and beta IJK is very low. So in a way, depending on how the market is composed, this allows us sort of like to see what's going on within each segment, and then aggregate that overall for hopefully like a better demand model there. Now, I think one thing that I wanted to add to your comment is that I think it's an excellent suggestion. So here we're not thinking about like having perhaps like different products that are catered to different parts of the market, but I think like for future work, I think it's an excellent idea that perhaps the assortments could be designed, like the products could be selected such that you might be targeting with some products, some segment of the market, perhaps towards more sales, and then perhaps with other types of products, target another part of the segment perhaps with for the rentals as well. So I think like the assortment decision would be very interesting to consider together with the sales and rental decisions, if I understood sort of like your point.
Yeah, excellent.
Roughly,
Thank you. Yeah.
But I think that's an excellent comment and suggestion. Thank you so much. Okay, so I think I could just proceed with the initial results. So our first result is that we can essentially show the structure of the decision for the optimal sales decisions overall. And so we find that the optimal sales is driven by a target rental rationing threshold. So I'll call that as RT bar. And this is roughly intuitive. So what this says is that overall, the company at each period would like to preserve some units for rentals. So for example, for the next period, it wants to start with some amount of rentals. This could well be zero, or essentially like the company might decide that towards when they're approaching the end of the horizon, there's really no repeat revenue opportunity from rentals anymore. So there's really no need to carry any more rental units, and they can just liquidate all your items towards the end of the horizon. But at the initial stages, it might be the case that they might want to ration, save, or protect, in other words, some of their units only for the rentals for the future periods. And the policy is that so essentially the company would like to ration RT bar of its inventory for future periods. So it will only consider selling XT minus RT bar in terms of like satisfying the sales demand. Now here we have two subcases. The first case is that the company might be starting that particular period with a low inventory. So here's that low threshold here compared to the demand realization. If that is the case, it turns out that the limiting factor here, along with the rationing threshold, would be how much the company would have at the end of the period after satisfying its rental demand. So overall, the company would satisfy the sales as much as either its rationing policy allows, or if its rationing policy allows for more, it can only satisfy as much essentially available inventory it has on hand after it has satisfied that period's demand. So this will be the total sales quantity. If the company starts if the firm starts that period with a large enough inventory, then either its sales quantity will be determined by the rationing quantity as before, or in this case, if it has a lot of inventory available, it will just opt to satisfy all sales demand. So if the rationing is not limiting, then it will go and satisfy all of the sales demand that it observes. So overall, we could say that the optimal sales admission policy is just defined based on a rationing threshold for rentals. Like at every period, the company would like to retain part of its inventory for rentals for the future periods, and based on that saved amount, it either satisfies like all of the units up until that save amount, or other boundary conditions can kick in, where in one case it might just sell all remaining items, or in the other boundary condition, it might satisfy all sales demand. Next, we find that the optimal sales allocation increases with XT. So this is the starting inventory. So the more inventory the company has, the more its sales allocation will be. And I think this is pretty intuitive. And we also find that the sales allocation increases with alpha and decreases with beta. So alpha was the fraction of consumers who were interested in sales, and beta was the fraction of consumers who were interested in rentals. So sales allocation increases when there are more people in the market that prefer to actually buy, and decreases as more people in the market prefer to rent. Essentially, the rationing thresholds change based on the alpha and beta in the market, and the resulting policy is that it allocates more sales when there are more people in the market who want to buy, and more people, and the sales decrease as there are more people in the market who want to rent. Now, about the initial ordering quantity problem, at the very beginning of the horizon, so let's call that period 1, the firm also decides on the initial quantity Q in order to maximize its value all throughout the horizon once it implements the optimal policy, minus an initial purchase price for the quantities that it obtains. So we can show that this also has a nice behavior, and there exists a unique initial optimal order quantity which satisfies this first order condition. Now, I want to move into sort of like in sensitivity analysis, which I think there are more interesting insights besides the policy characterization itself. So let's take a look at first about the impact of rental and sales prices on the optimal policy. We find that the optimal rental threshold, so the amount that the company, the firm would like to save for future rentals, decreases with the current sales price PS and does not change with the rental price PR. So the second bit does not change, occurs due to the prioritization of rentals. So its price doesn't come into play here in determining the threshold, but it does influence the quantity. And the first bit also is quite intuitive. I think that if the sales price is higher, so if you can sell the item at a higher price, then there's essentially less need to protect units for rentals in the future periods. So the rental threshold, the rationing threshold decreases when the sales price increases. In terms of the quantities, we find that the optimal sales quantity may either increase or decrease with the sales price, but it always increases with the rental price. Now, so this has essentially two underlying dynamics here. So the first one is, let's consider the cases where we're away from the boundaries. So we're looking at interior solutions here. In other words, the sales quantity is purely determined by the rationing threshold. So we will sell all the units in between our current inventory position and our rationing or protection for the future period, right? So if, let's say, we started with 10 and we wanted to preserve 8 for rentals, we will sell 2 units in that period. So in those cases, the optimal sales quantity increases with the sale price and does not change with the rental price. And this immediately follows from this previous result here, in that when the sales price increases, the threshold goes down. So if the threshold goes down, we would sell more product. So the sales increases with the sales price. And the rental price does not impact the threshold, so it doesn't also impact the sales quantity. At the boundaries though, so the boundaries are where we sell either everything that's left over. So we started with XT and we satisfied BDT of the rental demand, and this is what's left. And it turns out that it's best for us to sell everything. Or another boundary condition is that we sell all the sales demand that we observe. So if the sales demand is 3, we meet all 3. So in these cases, the sales quantity decreases with the sales price. So not increases, but decreases this time. And the reason is that when the sales price is higher, it means that more people will flock to renting. And if more people rent, we essentially have fewer units to sell. And similarly, if more people rent, that means fewer people buy. So we will sell also fewer units. So in either case, the sales quantity decreases. And with similar logic, the sales quantity increases with the rental price. Now, regarding the influence of market characteristics on the optimal policy, we find that the optimal sales allocation increases with retained repeat use valuation. So as people retain more of their valuation from their subsequent units, we tend to sell more units. And it decreases with the fraction of consumers who have higher desire for variety. So if more people are more fashion conscious, like if more people have higher desire for variety, that means they have lower repeat use valuations, then we sell less. Let me skip this for a moment. I'll just jump to outside utility. We find that the optimal sales allocation, ST star, decreases with the strength of the outside utilities. And this also, I think, is quite intuitive. If people have better options outside, they might be more willing to rent, and that also in turn decreases our sales. And also it decreases with the fraction of consumers who have better outside utilities. Regarding the frequency of use, so this doesn't have a clear monotonicity. When the frequency of use increases, essentially two things happen. One is that the people get more valuation overall because of the subsequent usages. And so that might tend to increase the sales. But the other issue here is that if the retained repeat use valuation is very low, with each subsequent use, that valuation becomes very, very low very quickly. And in such a case, it might not justify paying the purchase price. And in fact, it might reduce the sales demand as well as the sales allocation. So essentially, these are in a way coupled. The frequency of usage, it might increase for high repeat use valuations, but it might tend to decrease if the repeat use valuations are lower. Now, let me very briefly touch on the impact of lost and damaged units. So we consider a very brief extension where we let a fraction of currently rented items to be lost. So these can no longer be rented due to either excessive wear or damage or loss. Or you could interpret this as maybe the person just liked the product so much that they don't want to return it and they want to keep it. So in other words, only 1 minus L fraction of rented units will be able to be used for rentals in the subsequent period. And we let the retailer be compensated for any lost items by a certain fee of PL. And this PL can also be interpreted as the price that a consumer would pay if they want to keep the item after they rent it. The model is quite similar in the nature about like its general structure, but except this time the loss essentially determines our next state. So we now also need to subtract L fraction of what we have rented out, because that will not be returned for the next period. But instead, now we get compensated for that fraction for an amount PLT. We observe that the renting rationing policy remains optimal. So there is some sort of like a threshold policy again. But now the difference is that we find that in this case, when there's a loss, the rental rationing threshold now depends also on the current period demand realization DT. So the realization DT immediately impacts the RT, that how much we would need to preserve for the next period. And the optimal rental rationing threshold increases with an increase in the current period loss fraction LT. So essentially, if more units get lost, we tend to preserve, because we're prioritizing the rental units, or if more units get to be sold, essentially, we increase the rental rationing threshold. Okay, Now, let me show you some numerical results. We wanted to test the value of the optimal dynamic allocation. So we tested essentially a number of different instances where we looked at various different initial inventory positions, as well as various different horizon lengths. And what we observed was that the value of applying the optimal policy compared to a non-rationing policy, in a way like a first come first serve type policy, where whenever you see a sales demand, as long as you have the inventory available, you satisfy it without protecting any units. So we looked into the percent profit improvement of the optimal allocation compared to this non-rationing, or like in a way first come first serve type policy, across different initial inventory levels as well as different horizon lengths. And what we observed is essentially, like I can maybe just summarize it into two parts. The first one is that the value improvement could be really substantial. So we've seen cases where our numerical results indicate that the percent improvement could be very, very high. So in these numerical examples, for example, we see it could go up to almost like 40% improvement in profits when you do optimal allocation. And in terms of insights, perhaps the more important bit is that this value is highest for a small to intermediate inventory range. When inventory is very, very low, there is really not much value in optimal allocation. And the reason is that inventory is so low that essentially it's always taken up by the rental demand. And really there is no way to satisfy the sales demand, and therefore optimal allocation or the first come first serve cannot really differ much. And so the value improvement is quite small. And if we have very high inventory levels, again, the value improvement is very, very small. And in this case, essentially, we can not only rent the units, but we can also easily meet the sales demand because we have ample inventory. And so that's why the optimal allocation doesn't really bring any additional value. But if our inventory is in the intermediate, like small to intermediate range, then the value could be very substantial. We also looked at the value of the optimal dynamic allocation according to different rental to sales ratios in the market. So in markets where either the rentals or the sales make up like a substantial part of the market. So either the beta over alpha ratio, the rental to sale ratio, is very low or it's very high, meaning that the market is quite lopsided. In this case, the value improvement is rather reduced. But we see the highest value essentially in instances where the market is fairly balanced. So especially for firms who really cater to the rental and the sales market that are roughly of equal sort of like amounts, then this optimal allocation would bring in the most value to them. And lastly, in this part, I also would like to show you our results from a heuristic study. So computing the optimal policy for a single product actually is not very computationally extensive. However, it's also like for an application point of view, in terms of like for a retailer that might have a lot of products, it might still not be very easy to compute these rationing thresholds optimally. So we wanted to derive and test a very simple heuristic policy. So let me briefly explain to you the logic of this heuristic policy. So let FR denote the single period distribution of rental demand. So we can obtain this information like either historically or through our forecasts overall. And the retailer increases the rental allocation R as long as the unit, the amount that they expect to make from that particular unit, if it is kept in rentals towards the end of the horizon. So for each period, they will make PR minus CR from that unit. and they have T minus T periods to go. And this is the probability that that unit will be sold in any particular, the unit will be rented in any particular period. So this is the overall revenue or profit in a way that the firm would get from keeping this unit as rentals. So if this exceeds the sales price, it is better to keep this unit as a rental. So with each additional rental unit kept in the in inventory, obviously it gets less and less likely that that unit will be able to be rented in each period. So that this probability goes down. And there is a certain threshold where at some point PS might be more valuable. So essentially we increase this rental threshold until this expression is satisfied. So this is very similar to the Littlewoods rule. One difference here is that in the revenue management literature in the Littlewoods rule, there is a clear distinction between a high price item and a low price item. Whereas the distinction here is that there is really no ordering of prices of revenue contributions throughout the horizon. At the very beginning of the horizon, the contributions from rental might be higher, and at some point it might switch and the rentals might be less valuable and the sales might be more valuable. So that's what complicates this a little bit. But regardless, when we try this across a wide range of parameter choices, we find that the heuristic policy performed really well. And across all the instances that we have tried, the difference between the optimal policy and the heuristic policy turned out to be quite small, 0.28%. Now, so this is our sort of like main results about the primary rental model. Let me very briefly introduce you some of our results on the primary seller model. So these are retailers that primarily sell, but they rent on the side. Now, I want to introduce you the timeline of events for this case. Again, the retailer sets an initial inventory level, decides on an initial quantity at the beginning of the horizon that will be used to serve both the sales and rental markets throughout the horizon. And in each period T, the retailer observes its inventory levels. In this problem, now we need to distinguish between what is new inventory and what is old inventory, because these retailers tend to be like the primary sellers are the ones that are selling new items. And if an item is used as a rental, then that item cannot be sold as new anymore. So we really have to distinguish between what is a new product and what is a previously rented product, or like a product that has been allocated for rentals. So that's why we use a two-state formulation here. XT now will denote the new product inventory, and YT denotes the previously rented inventory. And in this model, the retailer fulfills as much of the sales demand as its inventory permits initially. And at the end of the period, it decides on how much to additionally allocate for rental. So how much of the rental to meet. And let's call that RT. And as before, all of the units that are rented will be returned at the end of the period and will be available in subsequent periods. So here is the dynamic programming formulation. Again, our state now consists of the new inventory level and the old inventory level. So the new inventory level would be used to meet the sales demand as much as possible. And our existing old inventory will be used to meet that period's rental demand as much as possible. And based on what we have left over from the new inventory, we might move part of that inventory to satisfy additional rental demand if there is any. And if we do move, then in the next period, our new inventory will be reduced by what we have sold, also with the transferred units to rentals. And our rental inventories will be increased by what we had in the rentals in the previous period, plus the new inventory units that are moved. And we can similarly formulate the initial order quantity problem where we decide on the best Q to maximize our entire valuation throughout the horizon minus the purchase cost for those initial quantities. Now, the policy here overall is again of a threshold type. Essentially, now we have a rationing threshold on the sales quantity, on the sales units. So we would like to preserve some items for future sales. And the details, though, are a bit different. First of all, depending on the rental and the sales ratio, as well as our states of new and old inventory, we might have, if this condition is met, then the rental allocation becomes 0. So this indicates that when this condition is satisfied, so if the new inventory is relatively low compared to the already existing rental inventory, allocation is 0. And what this essentially results from is that either we don't have anything left over to move to the rentals, or we already had a lot of rental units that it was able to take care of its demand anyway, so it didn't really need any new units. Now, otherwise, so if this condition is reversed, then the optimal rental allocation is defined by a rationing threshold on the sales amount. And that threshold depends on WT, which is defined as the total inventory that we have after we satisfy that period's sales demand. So XT minus alpha T plus the rental demand. And we essentially, like before, satisfy or like move as much units as possible without exceeding the protection level for future period sales. And this could be either bounded by the amount that we have, essentially, or by the demand requirement from the rentals. We observe that this threshold increases with this intermediate inventory position of new items and less the satisfied demand and plus the rental units. So the more inventory we have, essentially, the more we will be keeping in terms of the threshold. But this also, in terms of the quantities, it results in the case that the optimal rental allocation quantity increases with XT. So the more new inventory we have, the more units we will transfer to rentals. And it will decrease with YT, meaning that the more already existing rental inventory we have, the less we will transfer for rentals for the period. And the rental allocation may increase or decrease with the demand. So there's really no monotonicity with the realized demand. And lastly, the rental allocation decreases with alpha. So this was the fraction of sales, and increases with beta. So this is the fraction of rentals. And just like before, we have an initial order quantity that could be easily obtained. It has nice structural properties that it just needs to satisfy a first order condition. Our results in terms of market characteristics are exactly the same. So when there's just sort of like interpreted from the rental moving point of view. So if there's more desire for variety, then we would move more units to rental. And if the outside utility is higher, we will be moving more units to rentals. And the frequency of use, again, may either increase or decrease the rental allocation, just like the same dynamics as I have pointed out as in the previous case. Now, just last couple of things that I wanted to mention is that we also extended the heuristic policy that we have devised from the previous case into this new model as well. We need to make a new modification where now when we keep an item for sales, we have to account for the probability that that item will be eventually sold throughout the rest of the horizon. So it's not immediately sold, but the probability that it might be sold or maybe remain unsold. We again tested the heuristic across various different parameters, and it turns out that this simple heuristic as well, taken from sort of like the revenue management literature, performs really well in this setting. The last thing that I wanted to very briefly mention is a no allocation model. So in this model, we don't really serve one particular demand with a priority and only serve the other one if we have sufficient units. And we have very briefly discussed this at the very beginning. In this last extension, we consider models where we make this allocation before even seeing the demand, and there's really no priority. And just the main takeaway here is that obviously the formulation is slightly different because we have to make that decision before we see the demand, but the resulting policy is again a threshold type policy. So we have a rationing threshold that depends on the intermediate, that depends on the inventory levels. In this case, it is a little bit more of a complicated relationship, but essentially we allocate based on a rental allocation threshold. So we would want to always preserve some units going into the future in sales, and if we have more new product inventory, then we would tend to allocate more rentals. And if we have more already existing rental inventory, we will tend to allocate less to rentals. And in this case as well, the market characteristics tend to have similar impact on the Optimum policy. So let me quickly wrap this up, and then I can hopefully take your questions in the remaining few minutes. So we consider the dynamic inventory allocation model for essentially mainly for a primary rental with sellers with selling on the side. We develop a consumer demand model that takes into account heterogeneities in frequency of use, variety seeking behavior, and outside utilities, as well as the valuation heterogeneity as well. So we showed that a threshold type policy was optimal, and we looked at how the market characteristics impact the rental allocations. We numerically observed that optimal allocation is quite important. Its value is substantial. And we devised a simple heuristic, which turns out to perform quite well. And we also extended the model to cases where the firm is a primary seller, or maybe the firm does not have any prioritization at all. So this is all in terms of the results that I wanted to share. And I'll be very happy to take your questions and your comments and suggestions.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I think now whoever has a question either will type into the chat box or raise their hands. So
and I think I can make you the host now safely.
Okay, well, if you need to though, go to the other slides.
Oh yes, sure.
Yeah, so
sure. Okay, I'll keep it.
Okay. I tried to raise my hand, but okay, I think I did. Okay, good. So I'm not one of the attendees, but seem like a panelist. So if there are no questions at first, I actually have two questions, which I'm hoping one of them might be dumb, but I'll ask that one first. Seems very interesting. Really interesting, but I didn't know that such a market was flourishing or flourished already. Is there? Did you have a chance to, or are you planning to try and test this at one of these companies that's implemented this kind of business model, at least for on the site, for example, just one line, try to see if try to implement this kind of policy, that this will be the best thing, or maybe is there a chance to try this on a past season and try to see if things would have worked out differently, like that kind of thing?
No, yes, this is actually an excellent question. We're actually we're hoping to do that. So we're trying to be in contact with some of these rental-focused companies, and we haven't done it yet. Like we haven't been able to put this into test in terms of like a real company setting yet. But that is something that we've been trying to find a way to actually do it. Yeah, we had some initial contact with some companies, and hopefully we might be able to do that in the near future.
Would be very interesting. Would be very interested to see the results of that as well, because part of my graduate work before I got my PhD was with apparel industry in the United States, and there what we did was simulation and how to store, where, inventory, that kind of thing in the supply chain. And in the end, we ended up actually, not we, but my advisors ended up convincing one of the chain stores, one or two of the chain stores, to first give us data to test the simulation model and the resulting inventory management system on past data first, and then on a real season for side product, and that proved very useful. So, and then this seems very promising as well. Can I also ask, there was this slide where you showed value of optimal dynamic allocation,
Yes.
the nice curves, and
Yes.
yeah, that one. This here, T is the planning horizon. So
Yes.
I'm guessing the biggest impact is on the longer planning horizon. When I think of these rental for the fashion items, I thought these are like highly fashionable. We were talking either that there are products that are highly fashionable, meaning that they would go out of fashion pretty soon with a shorter season, and there are some more basic things that you might want to rent out, like things that have been out there, like tuxedos and classical woman, I don't know, whatever they are called, nightgowns, let's say, more classical style nightgowns. Now, is the impact of higher impact of on the longer planning horizon? Does that kind of mean that there is more expected improvement on those kind of items versus some of the designer clothes that are like comes in fashion and then goes out of fashion quicker? Or is it just about, are you assuming a stable kind of demand for these things, and then this is just about how much longer you're looking into the future for the dynamic programming?
Yeah, so that's an excellent actually point. So first of all, one thing that we noticed was that these rentals are generally maybe like they're 4 days or a week overall. And so if you consider perhaps like a season that's maybe consider like the 2 main seasons, then in that case, roughly you might be looking into maybe 20 to 30 weeks if you're doing this on a weekly basis. So for companies who might offer perhaps longer rental duration, some do maybe 2 weeks, then for them, the time duration, even though the selling horizon, like the calendar year might be the same, but if they take these decisions maybe less frequently, like if they allow maybe customers to keep the items longer, they would have less periods in a way per rental. So it not only depends on perhaps like the really the calendar length, but also on how many times that they can turn over this product, like how many opportunities that they have. Versus like from renting to sales. So yes, like with items that I think have for companies, especially perhaps if they do this in a shorter basis, and if they have more periods to be able to turn around the rental products, then they might benefit even further in sort of like the optimal allocation than companies perhaps who offer longer rental durations and might have fewer opportunities to balance their inventory. So that's kind of, I think, one of the so like one takeaway from that, regardless of maybe like the fashion, the length. But apart from that, yes. So if everything else was the same, and if just the T was longer, if the fashion duration was longer, then yeah, we will observe that essentially it comes down to the more times that you can turn around the rental product, the more benefit that you'll get from being able to optimally allocate your inventory. So that's, I think, the main takeaway. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does, but it is, as I said, something very new to me, and so I was kind of curious about that season length. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Comments? If not, I thank you so much again for all of you, for all your attention and listening to our work. And I'll really look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully one day as well soon.
Yes, yes. yes, since you're from Izmir, and I know for a fact that you have been here last summer. So, so next time, allocate a day or two maybe for us, and we'll be very happy to host you here in the department and at the university, and talk further. And I'll get in contact further on. Not like to really talk to you further later on, but I have your contact information. And in case there's anyone interested, I think there's, if you don't mind, I'll share your email. Maybe anyone interested, if they want to, have any further contact with you. And I thank you very much for this opportunity, and hope to see you again.
Thank you again for your kind invitation and for this opportunity. So wishing everyone a nice day and a nice rest of the week. See you.
Yeah,
Thank
bye.
you again. Bye.